Caleb Jessup put the last coin on the counter and watched the man count it twice. $20 in mixed silver. The man's name was Burris, and he ran the dry goods store in Seward, and the young woman standing behind him with her hands folded at her waist had been working off her dead father's account for the better part of 2 years. Burris counted the money a second time, nodded, and pushed a receipt across the counter. Sam stood at Caleb's hip, 8 years old and silent, watching the transaction with the grave attention he gave to everything that mattered. Ruth Havens picked up the small canvas bag at her feet. It was the size of a flour sack, and it held everything she owned. They walked to the wagon without speaking. Sam climbed up first and sat in the middle of the bench. Ruth stood beside the wheel, waiting for instruction. Caleb gestured to the seat. She climbed up. She sat. She looked straight ahead at the road, and then, quietly, without turning to face either of them, she asked, "Can I stay past spring?" Caleb's hands went still on the reins. The question carried no negotiation in it. It was the voice of someone who had been moved 7 times in 2 years and had learned to ask early so the leaving would not catch her without warning. He set the reins and clucked the horse forward. "We will see how it goes." Sam looked up at her, then at the road. He said nothing. But when they reached the farm track and the wagon tilted hard on a frozen rut, his small hand came out and steadied her elbow, and he did not let go until the wheels ran level again. The Jessup place sat 40 acres east of the Smoky Hill River on land that was mostly grass and grit. Caleb ran 60 head of cattle on open range and kept a milk cow, 2 horses, and a coop of hens behind the house. The house was a soddy with a timber frame addition he had built the year before his wife died, and it still smelled of new lumber in the mornings, which was the only new thing about it. Margaret Jessup had been dead 14 months. She had taken a fever in January and been gone by the end of the week, and Caleb had stood in the dooryard afterward and looked at the snow and understood that he did not know how to do what needed doing next. Not the grief. The grief he could carry. What he could not do was tend the sick. He had not known what to give Margaret, what to cool, when to send for the doctor in Seward, who was 18 miles away and drunk by noon. He had stood beside her bed with his hands open and empty, and she had died, and he had decided that the thing he could not do was a sealed room inside him that no one would be permitted to open. He had brought Ruth Havens to the place for a specific, bounded purpose. She would cook, keep the house, mind Sam when Caleb was on the range, tend the kitchen garden, and stay through the winter at minimum. He would pay her $2 a month plus board. The terms were plain, and he stated them on the wagon ride home in the order he had written them down, because he had written them down so there would be no confusion. Ruth listened. She asked one question about the garden, whether the soil took beans, and then she asked nothing else. Sam sat between them and watched the country pass. When they pulled up to the house, he climbed down first, walked to the door, and held it open. He had never held a door for anyone except his mother. Ruth stepped inside and stood in the main room and took stock. The stove was cold. The table held 2 plates and 2 cups and a heel of bread gone hard. The timber frame room had a bed with the blankets pulled roughly flat, and the soddy room had a smaller bed that was Sam's, and beyond the back door a root cellar that was mostly empty. The kitchen shelf held a jar of salt, a tin of lard, and a paper sack of flour that had been chewed open by mice. She set her canvas bag on the floor beside the wall and turned to Caleb. "I will need 2 buckets of water and the oven lit." He brought the water. She lit the oven herself because the flue was tricky and she figured it out faster than he could have explained it. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge that evening, there was soup in the pot. The bread was cut away to the good part and toasted. The mouse-chewed flour had been sifted into a clean crock. and Sam's bed had been stripped, beaten, and remade, with the sheets tucked tight enough to pass inspection. Caleb stood in the dooryard and listened to the sound of someone working inside his house and felt something shift in his chest that he did not examine. On the third morning, Sam left his boots by the door beside Ruth's. He did not mention it. There were 3 pairs of boots now instead of 2, lined up on the board Caleb had nailed down to keep mud off the step, and the arrangement looked like a sentence that had been waiting for its last word. Ruth noticed. She moved her boots slightly to make the line even and said nothing about it. She cooked plain food and made it well. Biscuits that held together. Salt pork sliced thin and fried until it gave up its fat, then eggs cooked in that fat. Coffee boiled on the stove with the grounds settled by a splash of cold water, the way Margaret had done it, though Caleb did not tell her that. She simply made coffee the way a person makes coffee who has made it 10,000 times. Sam began waiting for her at the table each morning. He did not wait for Caleb. He waited for Ruth, because Ruth put the plate down and then sat across from him and ate, which was a thing Caleb had stopped doing sometime after Margaret died. Caleb ate standing at the stove or walking to the barn or not at all, and Sam had eaten alone for 14 months, and the fact that a woman sat at the table and looked at him while he chewed was enough to make him line his boots beside hers every morning like a contract renewed. On the 4th day, Ruth asked if there was a school. Caleb told her the school was in Seward. 18 miles, too far for a boy alone. Can he read? Some. His mother taught him his letters. I can keep going with that, if you want. Caleb wanted. He did not say how much. He walked to the barn and stood among the horses for a longer time than the horses required. The lessons happened at the kitchen table after supper. Ruth used a stick of charcoal and the back of a feed receipt, writing the words in a clear hand and making Sam copy them. When he got one right, she did not praise him with any show, but simply moved to the next word, which told him she expected him to get them right, which was a kind of respect he recognized. Caleb sat in the timber frame room and could hear them through the wall. The pencil on paper. Ruth's voice, low and steady. The occasional sound of Ruth tapping the table once when Sam lost focus, and the silence after the tap when Sam found it again. It was the sound of a house with a woman in it. He had forgotten what that sounded like, and now that he remembered, the forgetting seemed worse than the losing. On the 6th day, Sam asked Ruth to cut his hair. Caleb had been cutting it since Margaret died, and the results were ragged, and Sam had stopped caring because there was no one to notice. Ruth sat him on the stool by the kitchen door and wrapped a dishcloth around his shoulders and cut his hair with the sewing scissors, turning his head with her free hand, taking her time. When she finished, she brushed the loose clippings from his neck and turned him to face her and studied him the way a person studies work they have done carefully. Better, Sam touched his hair and then looked across to his father, who was watching from the corral gate, and the expression on the boy's face was not pride in the haircut. It was confirmation. He had tested something, and the test had held. The calf was down in the north pasture on a Tuesday. Caleb found it at dawn, lying on its side with its belly distended and its breathing shallow. He knelt beside it and put his hands on its flank and knew it was Scours. And he knew that Scours could be treated. And he knew that he did not know how. He had lost 3 calves the previous spring to the same sickness because he had waited too long and done too little. He carried the calf back to the barn over his shoulders, and Ruth saw him from the garden, and she set down the hoe and came without being called. She knelt beside the calf on the barn floor and put her hands on its belly the way a person touches something she has touched 100 times before. She pressed in 3 places. She lifted the tail and checked. She opened the mouth and examined the gums. How long has it been down? Since sometime in the night. I found it at first light. I need a raw egg, a spoonful of tallow and salt, and a clean rag. Caleb brought them. Ruth mixed the egg and tallow and salt in a tin cup and warmed it against the calf's body, and then she dipped the rag in the mixture and worked it into the calf's mouth, slow and patient, a finger's width at a time, letting the animal swallow on its own rather than forcing it. She held the calf's head in her lap and kept working the rag and the mixture for the better part of an hour, and when the calf's breathing steadied, she mixed a second dose and began again. By midday, the calf was standing, weak and listing slightly, but standing. Ruth was sitting on the barn floor with tallow on her sleeves and straw in her hair, and she turned to Caleb with no particular expression. "It should have charcoal water for 2 days. "I will make some." He stood in the barn doorway and watched her walk to the house, and what he felt was not gratitude, but something closer to shame. She had known what to do in 30 seconds. He had knelt beside the same animal and done nothing. The same way he had done nothing when Margaret's fever climbed past the point where cold cloths mattered. She came back with charcoal water in a bucket and began spooning it into the calf's mouth. Caleb leaned against the post. "Where did you learn that?" "My mother. She doctored everything on the place before my father lost it. The doctor in Seward charges $1. The doctor in Seward would have let it die and charged you the dollar after." That was the first time she said something that was not careful, and it was the first time he heard her voice carrying its own weight, and the sentence stayed with him long after the calf was back in the pasture. Over the next week, she treated a hen with bumblefoot, lancing the abscess with a knife heated in the stove, and packing the wound with pine tar and a strip of clean cotton. She treated Sam's cracked fingers with a salve she rendered from fat and dried yarrow she found growing along the creek bank. She treated a gash on the milk cow's udder that Caleb had been ignoring because he did not know what to do about it, packing it with a poultice of mashed comfrey leaf and checking it twice a day until the wound closed clean. Each time, she did not ask permission. She saw the injury and she fixed it. Caleb noticed that she never tended anything in front of him in a way that required him to acknowledge his own ignorance. She simply did the work, and the proof was a healthy animal or a healed hand, and if he wanted to pretend the problem had resolved itself, she gave him room. He did not pretend, but the room she gave him mattered more than he could have said. The letter came on a Saturday, carried by a rider heading through to Dodge who had stopped at the post office in Seward. It was addressed to Miss Ruth Havens, care of the Jessup place, and the return bore the name Eleanor Prescott Lawrence. Ruth read it at the table while Sam practiced his letters, and Caleb mended a harness in the dooryard. When she finished, she folded the paper twice, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to the bread dough she had set to rise that morning. Her hands kept the same steady rhythm, but Caleb had learned to read her posture the way he read weather, and he saw that her shoulders had drawn in by a fraction, and that she was pressing the dough harder than it needed. He did not ask about the letter. 3 days later, Sam told him, "Ruth got a letter from a lady who wants her to come work in Lawrence. The lady has a real house and pays $4 a month." Caleb kept oiling the saddle. "How do you know that?" "Ruth read it out loud to me because I asked what it said. She is deciding. That is her right. She has not decided yet." The boy's voice carried the particular weight of a child who has found the one thing that matters and is holding it very still so the adults will not notice him holding it. The talk reached Sam through the Pfeffer boys, whose father grazed cattle on the section west of Caleb's and whose mother had opinions about arrangements that lacked proper names. The Pfeffer boys told Sam at the creek crossing that his pa had bought himself a woman the way a man buys a plow horse, and Sam hit the older Pfeffer boy in the mouth and came home with a split knuckle and a silence that lasted 2 days. Ruth cleaned the knuckle and wrapped it with a strip of cotton. She did not ask how he got it. Sam sat on the bench and let her work on his hand and watched her face, and whatever he found there was enough to break the silence. They said Pa bought you. Your father paid off a debt. It is a different thing. Is it? Ruth tied the cotton strip and held his hand for a beat longer than the work required. Yes, it is. Caleb went to the barn that evening and stood among the horses and thought about $4 a month and a real house in Lawrence. He thought about what Ruth's hands did when she kneaded bread and what the kitchen sounded like when she taught Sam his letters at night. He thought about the fact that he paid her $2 a month to do the work of 3 people and that she had not complained once, and that Eleanor Prescott in Lawrence was offering twice the wage and probably a room with a locked door and probably a town with a church and a store and other women to talk to. He went inside. Ruth was at the table, sorting dried beans, picking out stones with her thumb and forefinger. I can go to $3. Her hands kept sorting. It is not about the money. What is it about? She picked out a stone and set it on the edge of the table. In Lawrence, I would be a housekeeper in a proper house with a locked door and a position that has a name. Here I am, a woman who was bought for $20, and there is no word for what I am. The sentence sat between them like the stone on the table. Caleb looked at it, at her hands, at the wall behind her where Sam's charcoal letters were still visible on the feed receipt she had pinned up for him to study. You are not bought. I paid off your father's debt. That is different. People see what they see. She was right. He knew it because he had heard the talk in Seward when he went for supplies. George Burris told a version of the story that was not incorrect but was not complete, and the version people carried home was that Caleb Jessup had paid $20 for a woman the way a man pays for a mule, and that she lived in his house, and that the arrangement did not have a name anyone cared to say in church. Ruth finished sorting the beans and put them in the pot to soak. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood. I have not decided. I told Sam the same. She went out to the root cellar, and Caleb sat at the table alone, and the house around him felt like a room holding its breath. The outsider came 10 days later, and she was not an enemy. Her name was Mrs. Adler, and she was the minister's wife from the church in Seward, and she rode out to the Jessup place on a Thursday morning with a basket of apples and a purpose that was kind and genuine and devastating. She sat at the kitchen table across from Caleb while Ruth made coffee, and Sam sat on the bench by the wall doing his letters. Mrs. Adler explained that the women of the church had been talking and were concerned about the arrangement. They had found a proper position for Ruth with a family in Wichita. A Christian family. $4 a month. A room of her own, small children who needed minding. A respectable position with respectable people, and the women of the church would pay Ruth's passage on the stage. Mrs. Adler was not cruel. She was doing what she believed was right, trying to save a young woman from a situation that lacked a name, and trying to save Caleb from the talk that was gathering around him like weather. You understand, Miss Jessup. It is not proper as it stands. A woman alone with a man who is not her husband. People will talk, and they are talking, and it will follow the boy. Caleb held his coffee cup and could feel the truth pressing against his chest like a hand. Ruth stood at the stove with her back to the room. She did not turn around. Her hands were still. Sam set down his charcoal. Pa cannot doctor the animals. The room went quiet. Mrs. Adler turned to face the boy. Caleb's hand tightened on the cup. When the calf was dying, Pa carried it to the barn and stood there. Ruth fixed it. When the hen had a bad foot, Pa did not know what to do. Ruth cut it open and packed it with tar and cotton. When the cow's bag was torn, Pa left it alone for a week because he did not know how to fix it. Sam's voice was steady. He was not defending or accusing. He was listing facts in the order they had happened, the way Ruth had taught him to arrange words on paper. Pa cannot do that part. Ma used to do it, and when Ma died, nobody could. 3 calves died last spring because Pa did not know what was wrong with them. Ruth knows. She knows every time. Mrs. Adler turned to Caleb. He kept his eyes on the table. The shame was a physical weight on his shoulders, and he did not raise his head, because raising it would mean seeing what his boy had just handed to a stranger, which was the full and open truth about his father. Sam was not finished. If Ruth goes to Wichita, who will doctor the animals? Pa cannot. I cannot. And you will not be here, Mrs. Adler. You will be in Seward arranging things for other people. The last sentence was not rude. It was a child's logic applied without cushion, and it landed cleanly, and Mrs. Adler's mouth opened slightly, and then closed. Sam turned to Ruth, who was still standing at the stove with her back to the room. You said I could ask you things. Can I ask you something? Ruth turned around. Her eyes were bright, and she was gripping the stove edge with one hand. Yes, will you stay past spring? He asked it the same way she had asked it on the wagon, weeks ago. The same words. He had been carrying them since the first day, holding them the way a child holds a thing too important to put down, and now he placed them back where they had started. Except this time, they were not a question about leaving. They were a claim. Ruth looked at the boy. She looked at the charcoal letters on the feed receipt pinned to the wall. She looked at the boots by the door. 3 pairs, lined up like a sentence. Yes, I will stay past spring. Sam picked up his charcoal and went back to his letters. He had said what needed saying. The rest belonged to the adults. Mrs. Adler left within the hour. She was not unkind about it. She touched Sam's head as she passed and told him he was a good boy. And she meant it, and she rode back toward Seward with the basket of apples still sitting on the table because she had forgotten it. Caleb sat at the table a long while after she left. Ruth cleared the cups and wiped the surface around him and did not speak. Sam finished his letters and went outside to feed the hens. That evening, after supper, Caleb went to the timber frame room and came back carrying a wooden box with a hinged lid. He set it on the table in front of Ruth. The box held Margaret's medicine chest, not her personal things. Those had been sent to her sister in Independence the month after the funeral. This box held the working tools. Inside were 6 brown bottles, a tin of carbolic salve, a packet of dried willow bark, a roll of clean cotton bandage, a bone-handled lancet, and a folded paper in Margaret's handwriting listing what each bottle contained and what it was used for. Caleb opened the lid and turned the box to face Ruth. Margaret kept this. She knew what everything in it did and when to use it. I never learned. Ruth studied the contents and then raised her eyes to his. After she died, I put it away because I could not open it without knowing I had failed her. The willow bark is old. The carbolic may be no good. I never checked. He pushed the box across the table. This is yours now. Fill it with whatever you need. Whatever it costs, I will pay. If the doctor in Seward has supplies you want, put them on my account. If a catalog has better, send for them. Ruth placed her hands on either side of the box. She lifted the folded paper in Margaret's hand and read it. She read it through twice. Then she set it back inside and closed the lid and put both hands flat on the table. This is not a small thing you are giving me. No, the town will see it as you giving me Margaret's place. The town will see what is true. The lamp threw their shadows long against the wall, and in the shadows the 2 shapes at the table could have been any married couple sitting at the end of a long day, which they were not, but the shadows did not seem to know the difference. I have something to say about the $20. Caleb folded his hands. I am going to the county office next week. I am going to register you as hired help with a wage of $3 a month and a claim on the house if anything happens to me. It will be on paper, and it will have your name. If anyone asks what you are, you will be a woman with a contract and a wage and a medicine chest and a position. And the position will have a name. What name? Whatever name you want. I am done deciding things for you. Ruth picked up the medicine chest and held it against her middle the way a person holds something that has been returned after a long absence. She carried it to the shelf by the stove and set it between the salt and the flour crock, where she could reach it without stretching, where Sam could see it, and where it would be the first thing a visitor noticed walking through the door. The contract was filed at the county office the following Tuesday. Caleb rode to Seward, stood at the clerk's window, stated the terms aloud, and signed his name. Ruth Havens was entered in the county record as hired position, Jessup Place, $3 a month, and the paper was real and filed and could not be undone by gossip or by church women with baskets of apples and good intentions. When he returned that afternoon, Ruth was in the barn. The calf she had saved 4 weeks earlier stood at its mother's side, fat and steady, and Ruth was checking the milk cow's udder where the gash had healed to a clean white line. The medicine chest was open on the barn floor beside her, and she had added 3 new bottles, purchased that morning from the peddler who came through on Mondays. Yarrow tincture. Comfrey poultice in a sealed jar. A small brown bottle of camphor oil, labeled in her own handwriting. Sam sat on a hay bale nearby, reading aloud from a book Mrs. Adler had sent out with the post rider, a kindness neither Caleb nor Ruth mentioned, but both understood. The boy read slowly, sounding out the difficult words, and Ruth corrected him without raising her eyes from the cow. The two of them moved through the work and the words together like people who had been doing it for years rather than weeks. Caleb leaned against the barn door. The air carried hay and animal warmth and the faint camphor edge of whatever Ruth had been mixing. Sam's voice held the rhythm of reading that is becoming easy, the last hesitation before fluency, where words simply arrive when they are needed. Ruth's hands moved across the cow's flank with the certainty of a woman who knew her work and was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to do it. 3 pairs of boots stood by the kitchen door. The medicine chest sat on the shelf between the salt and the flour, its lid closed but unlatched, because Ruth Havens kept it ready. And on the table, 3 plates, 3 cups, a lamp burning low, and above Sam's bench the feed receipt where his letters were growing smaller and more even with each passing week.